lag is still real. Sheesh.
Allied UAV.
Alright.
Enemy at the Allied counter UAV. Enemy UAV overhead. Enemy in the jump pad.
Hey, Ken, what's up, man? Hey, how's the lag right now? Let me know.
They're killing us. Pick yourselves up.
Oh no! How did I end up dying? Yeah, man. The lag isn't. The audio fixed, but lag isn't. Yikes. Yeah, Ken, things are good, man. Thanks for hopping in, man. How's your day?
Allied cluster strike.
No, we lost.
Abort mission. Regroup.
Hey, Ty, open your settings, go to video tab, make sure you have VSync on, and you're capped at 60 FPS. Okay. Audio's really loud. Hey, my game. Settings. Come on. N65. Hold on. Game settings. Well, I'm not having problems with my game, though, to be honest. My game's fine. But it seems like my OBS is struggling. Hold on. Before I start a new game. I mean, I can check. I know, I have it unenabled on there for a reason. Hold on. I know what I want to do. I can't fix it now. Okay, hang on. Why can't I go? Alright. I guess I'll just put it on games. I'll do it. I will do it. I was trying to do it through the NVIDIA GeForce, and I'll try to remember now. Here it is. Play settings. Alright. Hopefully that helps. That's my capped. It's at 144. It's at my refresh for my monitor. You know? Yeah, I have it set at 144. So, I don't know. I haven't been streaming it lately. I haven't been streaming COD. I've been playing COD, but not streaming it. So let's give this a try. Let's see. Try not to use VSync because sometimes it adds extra input lag. So it might be my issue, Kingpin. But how's your night going, man? What's going on? I know it's 1:13 in the morning for us. Over here dying. I need to play a game or two. I think we lost Tiger. Tiger was in here. Find out he's gonna get into Assassin's Creed Odyssey. I thought that was cool. Sync will help you. I'm at the game. You should always try to keep it capped at 60 because you can't stream more than 60 FPS. I know what you mean. Well, Tiger Sim, what's going on, man? Thanks for sticking around, dude. Yeah. Dude, I definitely stream more than 60 FPS. Or not more, I don't stream 60 FPS. Yeet! Hold on. Tell me if this is bad this next time I'm going in. See what happens with this. Because I thought I was doing fine streaming at, playing the game at 144. And then keeping my stream at 60 FPS. But see, the menu obviously doesn't have an issue.
Headquarters.
There will always be some delay. It's set at 2 seconds right now.
Capture and defend each HQ as it comes online.
Unless you're playing competitive, you're not gonna even notice the input lag, brother. It's like the difference. Yeah, I know what you mean. Bye. It's off to the right. How's that? No, we're still doing bad.
Enemy personal radar in the air.
Dude, I notice the input lag on this game all the time.
Get over there.
You guys see that guy? Doing well. It's so freaking terrible. Because I wasn't having an issue when I was running this game at like 300 frames per second. So I don't. I'm all sitting here panicking, dude.
Enemy's got the lead. Hustle up.
Yeah, it's still clipping bad.
Strike incoming. Take cover.
Oh. Is it doing better now?
UHQ established.
Oh no, I got whacked from behind. Nah, it's still clipping bad. I don't know why it's clipping bad still. What's another possibility, Ken?
Enemy UAV overhead. Enemy at the junction.
Come on, unlock this. It's almost there.
We're taking the HQ. No reinforcement.
Nice. Alright, getting out of there. Are we gonna die? Oh, he got me. Good night, says us. See ya. I know, the game's terrible, because it's just been ripping.
Reinforcements yet. Hold for the next wave.
Yeah, I don't know. Something else must be going on right now.
Almost done here. Ready up.
Guys, let me know if this makes it better, because maybe I'm taxing my bandwidth too much. Which is weird, it shouldn't be taxing so bad.
Head to the new HQ.
Find out it's just my freaking... Oh no, why? That's not what I meant to push it. Shoot!
Enemy
When you press a button when you don't want to. Ooh. Guys, I'm crying.
Enemy at the Danny Town. Enemy cluster strike incoming. Take cover. HQ is online. Secure. Go.
Nice comeback.
Enemy has captured the HQ.
You bastards!
Enemy in the courtyard.
Watch it, you muppet!
Guys, just shooting my own teammates. That's okay, right?
HQ secure.
Nice. No clue where they're gonna be spawning.
Almost
Check your bloody
care
fire!
package inbound.
I just said check your bloody fire.
Established.
Nice! Can't believe I got that kill. They're slowing me down. My teammates slowing me down?
Friendly UAV overhead.
Oh, crap.
Enemy UAV overhead. Enemy counter UAV. HQ is
Oh, dude. Why do they got so many?
Enemy has captured the HQ. Enemy cluster strike incoming.
Yeah, they got you. One man killing machine? I wish. Nice. Where did that guy come from? I was in my own little world for a second. I was like, oh, everything's good. Oh, man. Alright. That hurt. I shouldn't stand so close. Touch the fire, it burns you. You know? No! Almost made it.
Enemy in
No! Oh well. I got an assist for that. Nice. Damn it.
HQ up in tech. Get ready.
Try to not get shot by other people. Woo!
The new HQ.
How's it doing right now? I'm not dropping any frames. I don't know, guys. Well, let me know. Am I still lagging pretty badly? Oh. Man, I messed up.
Enemy
I messed up, guys.
HQ is green. Get a move. Capture HQ.
Oh no! I should have checked left first. Guys, I'm dying inside.
They've taken the HQ.
Oh, what? Oh, from behind. Got me. And he's sneaky.
Get it together. This ain't over yet.
Oh, took out my teammate, huh?
Enemy.
I think that's all of them, right? No, apparently not. It's something that personal radar. Oh, we lost! No!
For debrief.
Hold on, you guys aren't answering if it's still clipping. Barely lost. Thanks, Tiger. Hey, how does it look though? It's weird how I can't actually check my stream from my OBS. I gotta make sure this is all good and running. But, let's see. High CPU usage. Okay. I'll try different things. It was still choppy? Okay, thank you for letting me know. Alright, I'm gonna give a couple things a different try. I just don't understand, Tiger, because it's like I wasn't having quite any issues with it.
Domination.
On my end. Usually, like, I see a lot of game lag. At the same time, I see
Capturing the
stream lag, but
positions.
this is like the one time.
Thermite out!
Assist your team at B.
Alright, cool. But I learned lately.
Hostiles at Bravo, go.
Thermite out!
Hostiles at Bravo. Losing Alpha.
Oh, he got me good.
Assist your team at
Maybe it's our internet just taking a shit at the end of the month. I mean, I would say yes, but
enemy holds all objectives. We're taking Bravo.
yeah, because now I'm starting to get lag on my side.
Back alley.
We're on Charlie, stand by.
Enemy at the cargo containers.
We're taking Alpha. Captured Alpha.
Oh, dude, this guy ran. How could he run, man? How would he not let me kill him? No. What the heck?
Enemy at the
And sauce?
Enemy UAV overhead.
Enemy UAV overhead, that's right. Eee! Apparently, I did not know they were going to do that. Alright.
Enemy holds two objectives. Get those positions. We're being dominated. We're holding
So weird. Anyways, yeah, I learned recently.
by.
Now my computer's lagging.
It's in the area. Six.
Losing B.
Oh no, I'm freaking lagging so bad I threw grenade at my face. Yeah, see how bad that is right now?
Securing B.
Oh man, that should have been enough though.
Counter UAV at
Oh fuck.
taking Bravo.
No! It might be your internet. Crappy internet.
We're taking out. Enemy holds two objectives. Securing Bravo. Captured Alpha.
Oh crap, he's getting from me. Alright. Let's see. Hopefully this eases up a bit.
Assist your team.
Jack Mortimus.
Enemy personal radar in the air.
Great. Got a personal radar up in there. Well, crap.
Securing C.
Eating grenades left and right. Alright. We're just doing this way.
Captured Alpha.
Oh. Well, he wasn't paying attention.
Securing Bravo.
Enemy at the shantytown.
Got Bravo.
Nice. No! I don't think that works that way, Ty. Learn your lesson. Oh. Okay. Well, I like how the guy survived all that. Usually I'd die when the... Alright.
Enemy halfway there. Step it up. Enemy UAV overhead.
Oh, what? I still died. Oh, did someone shoot me from behind? Yeah, he shot me from behind.
Take him back.
You guys like that dance? Oh no, I killed myself. No! I need to stop throwing these at the wall. That'd be great.
Enemy at the junkyard.
Enemy UAV overhead. Assist your team at Alpha. Enemy precision airstrike. Take it. Securing B.
Oh, take cover! Take cover! Guys, I'm going to take cover!
We're holding Alpha.
Oh man, something happened. You picked the wrong time to boast through there, man. I'm just trying to avoid the enemy. The cluster strike. They keep doing. They try to... Oh no, I got stuck! Thanks. You saved my life.
They've got two objectives. Keep it. Securing Bravo. Get those positions. Securing B. Securing C. We're holding Charlie.
I don't just see. You can't see me either. Oh, fudge!
I'm taking fire!
Alright. You can play that game too.
We're taking out. We've got out.
Alright. Never mind. Just need Bravo.
Hostiles at Bravo, go.
Oh.
Lost Bravo. Stand by.
Junkyard.
Oh, come on. Oh, teammate there.
You're needed at Alpha. Securing Charlie. Enemy holds two objectives. Take them. Enemy holds all objectives. We're taking.
No.
We're holding Charlie. We're holding Bravo.
Scared, guys. I'm scared. I'm scared.
Enemy at the junkyard.
Oh crap! Oh, that was just a chaos. That was all a chaos. Oh crap! I ran into those grenades.
Enemy at the back alley.
Oh.
backup at Charlie. Hostiles at Bravo, go. Step it up. Securing Alpha. Lost Bravo.
Oh, dude, come on. You guys flipped this.
We're holding.
Keep flipping these damn spawns.
Securing Bravo. You're needed at Charlie. We've lost Charlie.
Oh, no. $400 man got smart. $400 perm. I think that's what his name is.
Enemy UAV.
Yeah, it says $400 perm.
Hostiles at Alpha, go.
Oh! What just happened? Why? We lost. No! I think our internet took a dookie. Alright, Tiger, if you're still here, thanks, man, for sticking around. I'm gonna call it a night. It's hard for me to call it a night because I love COD when it goes good like this. I only died 14 times. It's only a chisel. Flesh wound saw. Only a flesh wound saw. And I'm still on trying to unlock all those stuff on AK-47. It's probably why I'm having a hardest time, dude. Magazine ammo capacity goes up to 75. Aim down sight slower. You pretty much got a small little LMG. What's wait? Bayonet. Bayonet people. What? Thanks, man. Good luck with the stream. Appreciate it. I'll catch you next time, dude. Enjoy hopping in Discord, man. I gotta go. What am I doing? I'm gonna sit here into another game before you even know it. But yeah, Tiger, join the Discord and I'll post selfies there. It's just a fun little group. It's the Dragon's Cabin. Alright. Come in, relax, kick your shoes off, enjoy your night. I will see you, dude.